Hey guys, it's Courtney. Today I'm going to be creating a almost one layer card with the Sweets and Treats stamp set by Create a Smile. I'll also be using the mini bricks stencil by the Crafters Workshop, as well as the Believe stencil by Simon Says Stamp. I'm starting by just laying out my masks here that I already have cut out, just to kind of get my placement before I actually start stamping. Once I had that laid out the way I wanted it, I am going to go ahead and stamp my images with Blackout ink by Ink on 3, and this is a piece of Nina Solar White 80-pound cardstock. I'm going to start by stamping my stocking because this will be the image that's in front, and I'll mask that with a piece of Simon Says Stamp masking paper, and then I'm going to stamp my little bear here because he's going to be in front of the little presents. So any object that you want to be in front of another, you're going to want to stamp and mask first. And then I'll stamp my presents and mask those out as well. And then finally go ahead and stamp one of the little candy canes, and that will appear to be kind of in back of all of my other objects. When you're cutting out your masks, you want to just make sure that you're cutting right along that black line so that you don't have any kind of white outline around your images once you do your ink blending. And you do want to make sure that they're lined up the best you can when you're masking out your stamped images. Once everything was masked out, I'm going to be taking some distress inks, and these are regular distress inks. You can certainly use the oxides for this. I'm starting with some antique linen, and I'm just going to be putting a little bit of a base coat, I guess, around my image. I'm not going to go all the way out to the edges of my card panel, and I am starting right on the mask and kind of working my way out to white. This won't be all that noticeable. I just wanted to put a little bit of color down before I used my stencil. Next, I took that stencil and I typically tape down my stencil from the back so that you don't get those lines from your masking tape or your washi tape, whatever you use. And I'll just put that on all four sides. This way my stencil doesn't shift around as I'm doing more ink blending. Next, I'll go in with some vintage photo distress ink, and I'm pretty much just adding this to the center of my card panel, right around my little images. You'll see there I'm starting right on my masking paper again, kind of just working my way out just a little bit, and then I'll go in with that antique linen again. And I'm just going to blend this out a little bit. Again, not going all the way to the edge of my card panel. Once my ink blending was done, I removed my Post-it note tape there, as well as my masks. And you just want to be careful when you're removing your masks. Distress ink takes a little bit of time to dry, and it can kind of seep through your masks a little bit. I typically, like for this larger image, for the stocking, I'm laying it right along my card panel as I'm peeling it off. So we're going to move on to the Copic Coloring, and I'm starting off with my lightest color, laying out my darkest areas before I go in with my darkest color. We're going to be using a center light source for all of these images. This is the easiest way if you're just starting off with alcohol marker coloring. This is probably the easiest way to do your shading. I'm going to be using 4 color blends here. You can certainly use 3. Just keep in mind that whatever color you want your object to be, that's going to be your mid-tone. In order to get a contrast, a lot of times when people color, they'll say that there's really not enough contrast there. Don't be afraid to use a super light color and a super dark color, much darker and much lighter than what you want your image to actually be, and this will give you your contrast that you're looking for. So for this little bear, my shadows are going to be on either side of his little face, above his little snout, underneath his arms, and where his scarf is. They would cast a shadow on his little belly there, and on either side of his body. My darkest color is the E37. My 2 midtones are the E33 and the E31, and my lightest color is the E30 for this one. Once my little bear was done, we'll move on to this little present, this larger present that's next to him. We're going to be using our greens for this, laying out my darkest colors with my darkest areas with my lightest color, which will be on either side because of the center light source. but also where the top of the box is laying over the rest of the box would also cast a shadow. So when I go in with my darkest color, I'm just adding a tiny little bit. For the shadow where the lid of the box is, I'm just really putting a line there and just very little flicks on either side of the present. Then I'll move on to my G07 and I'm going to extend those flicks out a little bit further. And for that shadow that's underneath the lid of the box, I'm just going to make that line just a little bit thicker. Same thing with the G03. I'm just extending the flicks and making that line a little thicker, and then I'll blend the rest out with my G12. Next, we'll move on to the candy cane, and if you're going to color any white object with shadows, do that first. I didn't do that first, but any lighter areas you're going to want to color before you color in your darkest areas, especially when you're using reds. But for this one, I am creating a shadow on either side of these little stripes. Not only are we using a center light source here, but this is also a round object. So whenever you're coloring a round object, you want to make sure that you leave a pretty strong highlight right there in the center. And for my darkest color, I'm just putting a line on either side, then extending that out with a few little flicks with my G46. Then extending those flicks out a little bit further with the the R35, and then finally going in with my R22 to blend the rest of that out. Now, like I said, for the white areas, I should have done this first. I just had to be super careful. I'm just putting a few teeny tiny flicks on either side with my C3, and then I'll extend that out with my C1, but leave the center of these little stripes still white. So any object that's white is still going to have shadows. So you want to make sure that you do add some shadows to any white images. Little teeny tiny ones don't really matter too much, but this one, you can see that it does still appear round. Next, we'll move on to the stocking. And for these smaller little stripes, I want these to appear white, but these are much longer than the little stripes of the candy cane. So I'm going to go in with my C5 and just add 1 or 2 flicks on either side of the stocking. And for this little toe area of the stocking, I'm just putting some on the top and the bottom. And for the heel, I'm just putting some off to the right. There wouldn't be necessarily any shading to the left part of section of this. The shadow would be on the stocking part itself. Next, I'll extend all of those areas out a little bit further with my C3, and then finally go in with my C1 and extend those areas out even further, but still, again, leaving some white areas as these are white objects. We're just adding the shadows. For the rest of the stocking, I'm going to be using the same red combination as I did for my little candy cane, and again, starting off with my lightest color, mapping out my darkest areas. So for the rest of the stocking, it's going to be pretty much the same as the little white stripes that we did. It's going to be on either side of the stocking. Underneath where it's kind of folded over on the top would create a shadow, so I just did one single line there. And where the little toe, it looks like it's sewn on, I just did one straight line there as well, because this would also cast a little bit more of a shadow. Next, I'll go in with my darkest color again, and I'm just going to do that one line on the top where it's folded over. And then on either side, I'm just doing very small flicks, and I'm just barely touching the tip of my marker to the paper. And for where the little toe of the stocking is, again, just one line that goes over that area. Once I had my darkest color down, we'll move on to the darkest mid-tone color, and I'm going to extend those flicks out a little bit further. And these little lines that we created for our shadows, I'm just going directly over it and just making it just a little bit thicker than we did with the darkest color. Next, we'll move on to the R35, doing the same thing again, extending those flicks out and making those lines just a little bit thicker. For smaller areas like that little top section of my stocking there. I'm not too worried about it only having a small highlight. Certain areas may not have a highlight at all, and certain areas may not have a dark color at all. It all depends on where it's placed and how much room you have to work with. Finally, I'll go in with my lightest color and flick all of those areas out just to get a better blend. And once all of that was done, I did quickly go over that same area again, just so that my flick marks were not so noticeable. You can certainly leave it like that. For this particular image, I decided that I didn't want to see any of my flicks at all. So I just quickly went over that area again. Now, I wasn't too careful, and I did go over some of those areas of the white with my red. I just took my C1 and went over that. It's such a light color. For the really light colors, you just have to think that these colors have a lot of the colorless blender in them. So if you go over a darker area, it's going to remove some of that color. Next, we're going to move on to this little bear's scarf or handkerchief here, and we're going to be using the same green combination as we did for the present. Again, just leaving the highlight there in the center. For the little bow on the present behind him, we're just going to be adding a little bit of shading in the center, and as the bow kind of flares out, it will be lighter. Next, I wanted to bring in just a little bit of a different color, so we're going to be coloring the bow of the first present and the present itself in the back, and this is going to be kind of like a golden yellow color. So it's going to look a little bit weird before it actually looks like what I want it to look like. So this is a little bit weird of a combination, but trust me, it works. So I'm going in with my E37, and that's going to be my shadow colors. Then I'm going to go in over that area with the Y28, and you can see it still looks kind of like a muddy brown. Once we add our Y26 and our Y23, you'll see that it actually does look like a golden yellow color. So just keep going. If it doesn't look right, just keep going. Once all of my coloring was done, I did take my white gel pen and just fixed up some of those areas that I was a little bit too messy with. And I also added some highlights to my little candy cane there, as well as my present, and along the left side of my stocking. My gel pen wasn't flowing that great, so I just rubbed that on my finger and heated up the tip of it, and you'll have better luck of it flowing out the ink. Once I had my highlights all down, I took a Nuvo Aqua Shimmer pen and just added shimmer to certain areas. You just want to keep in mind that this is, I think it may be alcohol based. You'll want to start with your white areas and maybe scribble off on a scrap piece of paper before you move on to the next color. Especially with the red, you can move that red around. So you don't want to put any sparkle on the red and then move on to a white area, because that will become pink. Once I had all of my shimmer down and all of my coloring was complete, I went ahead and took my die cut here, and I cut this out twice from Neenah Solar White, and this is 110-pound cardstock, so it's a little bit thicker. And I just used my Tombow Mono Multi Glue to adhere both of these die cuts together, just so that it's not so thin. It's not just one layer of cardstock, it's two. You can certainly add 3 or 4 layers, but this was a thicker cardstock to begin with, so I felt that 2 was sufficient enough. I also glued together the little dots for my eye, also with my Tombow Mono Multi Glue. I find that this is the best glue to use. It doesn't dry immediately, but still dries pretty quick. You still got some time to kind of move things around as needed. Next, I took that same Nuvo Aqua Shimmer and went over my die cut a couple of times to make this super shimmery, and then adhered that to my card panel right below my little stocking there with that same Tombow Mono Multi Glue. And once that was down, I did adhere my whole card panel to an A2 size top folding note card, and that is the card for today, guys. Thanks a lot for stopping by, and have a great day. Bye.